Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The content presented in this video is strictly for educational and entertainment purposes, focusing exclusively on historical events, specifically the intersection of 19th century family law and public theatrical figures. While we will be discussing past legal proceedings, courtroom strategies, historical statutes regarding marriage and separation, and the financial implications of historical divorce settlements, nothing in this video should be construed as contemporary legal, financial, or relationship advice. The laws governing marriage, divorce, alimony, and defamation have evolved dramatically over the last century and a half across all jurisdictions, and historical trends are absolutely not indicative of potential outcomes in modern legal disputes. Viewers facing personal legal challenges or domestic disputes should consult with a licensed attorney in their specific state or country. Always conduct your own due diligence and rely on certified professionals for any personal legal or financial matters. The year is 1851. The United States is a powder keg, slowly fracturing along ideological lines that will soon ignite the Civil War. Yet the entire nation's collective attention is unexpectedly hijacked by a completely different kind of warfare. It is a spectacular, vindictive, and thoroughly public destruction of a marriage that rivaled the scale of any national crisis. Enter Edwin Forrest. He was not merely an actor. He was the first true American celebrity, a titan of the theater whose immense physical prowess, booming voice, and aggressive acting style embodied the muscular, combative spirit of Jacksonian democracy. His wife, Catherine Sinclair Forrest, was a refined, highly educated British intellectual, representing the aristocratic elegance that working-class Americans simultaneously loathed and admired. Their union was initially heralded as the ultimate transatlantic triumph, a symbolic merging of old-world sophistication and new-world vitality. But it devolved into a courtroom bloodbath so vicious, so relentlessly sensational, that it spawned an entirely new cottage industry of penny presses, unauthorized verbatim trial transcripts, and literal public brawls in the streets of New York. Imagine the most toxic, high-profile celebrity trial of the 21st century. Strip away the digital filters and amplify the stakes to a time when a woman's entire societal survival, financial existence, and physical safety depended entirely on her legal standing and public virtue. The inciting incident was a single piece of paper. Forrest discovered a document that would become immortalized in American legal history as the infamous Consuelo letter. Written by a young, moderately successful actor named George Jameson and addressed to Catherine, the letter was florid, overtly romantic, and entirely devastating to the marriage. Upon its discovery, Edwin Forrest did not simply seek a quiet, dignified separation, which was the custom of the elite class at the time. Instead, fueled by a deeply bruised ego and a theatrical flair for the dramatic, he sought her total public annihilation. He immediately locked her out of their shared home, hired a team of private detectives to stalk her every movement across the city, and dragged her name through the mud in a heavily publicized, unprecedented petition to the Pennsylvania state legislature. He demanded a statutory divorce by legislative decree, attempting to bypass the standard judicial courts entirely to secure a swift, unquestioned victory based purely on his immense celebrity influence. When that legislative maneuver spectacularly failed, the battle moved to the civil courts of New York, transforming it into a grueling spectacle. The subsequent trial lasted an agonizing 33 days, an unheard-of duration for a domestic dispute at the time. Spectators lined up around the block in the freezing December weather, bribing court officers with exorbitant sums just for a standing room spot to hear testimonies that shocked the puritanical sensibilities of the era. Witness after witness took the stand, hurling accusations of infidelity in illicit, shadowy brothels, detailing secret nocturnal carriage rides, and describing scandalously unchaperoned parties. The burgeoning penny press published every sordid detail verbatim every single morning, essentially creating the modern blueprint for tabloid journalism and the monetization of private tragedy. But here is the critical pivot that makes this case legendary. Catherine, facing total financial ruin, immediate social exile, and the crushing weight of a patriarchal legal system designed to protect men of property, did not quietly surrender. She hired an obscure but notoriously brilliant lawyer named Charles O'Connor. Together, they orchestrated a defense strategy so unprecedented, so deeply calculated, and so aggressively counterintuitive that it fundamentally disrupted the legal establishment of the United States. How exactly did a woman with zero independent financial resources and a systematically destroyed reputation completely outmaneuver the most powerful, beloved, and wealthy man in American entertainment? How did she secure a record-breaking alimony settlement that Edwin Forrest would spend the next 2 decades and his entire fortune desperately fighting to overturn? For the modern American viewer navigating the extreme complexities of our current media landscape and adversarial legal system, understanding the precise mechanics of the Forrest divorce is not merely an exercise in historical trivia. It provides a foundational, highly applicable blueprint for recognizing how public narratives are engineered, manipulated, and weaponized during high-stakes disputes. Today, we are constantly bombarded by the weaponization of private text messages, the deployment of expensive public relations teams to sway potential jury pools, and the systemic inequalities inherent in elite legal representation. By meticulously dissecting the strategic choices made by both Edwin and Catherine, we are going to solve a critical problem for you today. We will completely demystify the illusion of the sudden celebrity downfall and the chaotic public trial. You will learn how to identify the invisible structural architecture of a public relations smear campaign, understanding the distinct sequential phases of isolation, accusation, and trial by media. Furthermore, we will break down the evolution of the concept of cruelty and fault in American family law, demonstrating through historical case studies how these specific 19th century precedents directly shape the modern legal frameworks governing asset division, spousal support, and defamation. This comprehensive deep dive will equip you with a sharper, more analytical lens through which to view not only celebrity culture, but also the very real, very harsh realities of modern legal warfare. We will explore the precise cross-examination techniques utilized by Charles O'Connor that effectively destroyed the credibility of Forrest's paid witnesses, step by step. We will examine the historical trends of alimony enforcement, analyzing how the absolute lack of institutional support forced individuals to rely on public opinion as a primary form of extrajudicial leverage. By the end of this extensive examination, you will not just know a fascinating story about 19th century theater. You will possess a comprehensive understanding of the specific strategies used to build and destroy reputations. You will understand the historical foundation of domestic legal rights in the United States and the enduring power of a meticulously crafted counter-narrative against overwhelming odds. This journey is about power, perception, and the brutal mechanics of separating 2 deeply entwined lives under the unforgiving, hyper-focused spotlight of public scrutiny. You will walk away with the analytical tools to critically evaluate any public dispute, recognizing the calculated strategic maneuvers hidden entirely behind the emotional rhetoric presented to the public. The stage is set, the actors have taken their places, and the gavel is about to fall on the most sensational, precedent-setting legal drama in the history of the American stage. The gavel drops in the freezing, overcrowded courtroom of the New York State Supreme Court. It is December 1851, and Chief Justice Thomas Oakley presides over a room so packed with agitated spectators that the physical structural integrity of the building is genuinely called into question by local authorities. The air is thick with immense anticipation and the smell of damp wool, as thousands of citizens clamor to witness the systematic public dissection of the Forrest marriage. To truly understand the sheer magnitude of the strategic warfare that is about to unfold, we must first establish the strict, unforgiving architectural framework of 19th century family law. In the modern era, obtaining a legal separation is frequently a matter of administrative processing, where parties might cite irreconcilable differences or the irretrievable breakdown of the marriage. However, analyzing the historical trends of New York State jurisprudence at this specific time reveals that the legal barrier to entry for an absolute divorce, known in legal terminology as a divorce of vinculo matrimoniae, was staggeringly high. There was exactly one recognized legal ground for such a complete dissolution: proven undeniable adultery. Edwin Forrest could not simply walk into a courtroom and declare that he and Catherine were no longer intellectually or emotionally compatible, nor could he rely on claims of emotional distress, public embarrassment, or financial disputes. To achieve his ultimate goal of a complete legal severance, a verdict which would free him to remarry and entirely strip Catherine of any financial claim to his substantial, aggressively accumulated estate, he was legally required to definitively prove that she had engaged in physical intimacy outside the bounds of their marriage. This absolute statutory requirement dictated his entire pretrial strategy and forced the conflict into the most degrading, publicly humiliating arena imaginable. Because Edwin possessed virtually unlimited financial resources and immense social capital, he initiated a highly sophisticated, privately funded espionage campaign against his own wife. Imagine if we look at a contemporary scenario in the year 2026. If a high-profile American public figure, Let us call him Michael Reynolds, a powerful television network executive with vast resources, decides to aggressively terminate his marriage today. His legal team might deploy highly specialized digital forensics units. They would routinely subpoena cloud storage backups, trace geolocational data from smart vehicles, and utilize advanced software to recover deleted, encrypted text messages to build a comprehensive, minute-by-minute timeline of his spouse's activities. The potential outcomes of modern legal discovery are deeply rooted in technological surveillance and data extraction. But in 1851, the technology of surveillance was entirely human. Edwin Forrest had to weaponize the domestic ecosystem against Catherine. He recognized that the ultimate observers of the elite class were the invisible working-class individuals who maintained their opulent, highly curated lifestyles. Forrest deployed a small army of private investigators and legally dubious intermediaries to systematically bribe, coerce, and relentlessly interrogate the extensive network of domestic servants, chambermaids, carriage drivers, and cooks who had ever been in Catherine's employ or physical presence. He built his entire prosecutorial narrative on the testimonies of these vulnerable individuals, painting a lurid, highly sensationalized picture of Catherine hosting raucous, unchaperoned gatherings involving vast quantities of alcohol, cigars, and other theatrical professionals while Edwin was away on lucrative national tours. The absolute crown jewel of this aggressively engineered narrative was the Consuelo letter. Written by George Jameson, a younger, undeniably handsome actor, the letter addressed Catherine as Consuelo, a direct reference to a romantic, mildly scandalous novel of the period. It was a flowery, passionately written document that Edwin claimed he discovered hidden deep within Catherine's personal belongings. In the court of public opinion, which was heavily influenced and aggressively stoked by the Daily Penny Press, the mere existence of this letter was treated as absolute, undeniable proof of a physical affair. Forrest's expansive legal team hammered this specific narrative relentlessly during the opening days of the trial, parading working-class witnesses to the stand who swore under oath that they saw Jameson secretly entering Catherine's private parlor, or who claimed to have found highly incriminating evidence of a hasty, panicked departure in her bedchamber. The public narrative was initially completely dominated by Edwin. He was the aggrieved, fiercely patriotic American hero who had been deeply betrayed by his aristocratic, culturally elite British wife. The historical trends of the era strongly suggest that a woman in Catherine's highly precarious position, facing a mountain of orchestrated witness testimony and the crushing weight of systemic public condemnation, was expected to simply collapse, accept a meager private settlement out of court, and disappear completely into permanent social exile. But this is exactly where Charles O'Connor, Catherine's relatively obscure but meticulously calculating attorney, executed a phenomenal masterclass in defensive legal strategy. O'Connor completely understood the complex psychological dynamics of the all-male jury. He knew with absolute certainty that aggressively attacking Edwin Forrest, a universally beloved national icon, right out of the gate would immediately alienate the jury and backfire spectacularly. Instead, O'Connor focused his intense cross-examination entirely on the logistical realities and the hidden financial motivations of Forrest's various witnesses. Through agonizingly detailed, step-by-step questioning, O'Connor began to systematically dismantle the rigid timeline presented by the domestic staff. He forced witnesses to admit under cross-examination exactly how much money they had received from Forrest's associates, allegedly for travel expenses and lost wages, masterfully exposing the undeniable financial incentives lurking behind their explosive, perfectly rehearsed testimonies. O'Connor brilliantly demonstrated, using detailed architectural floor plans of the Forrest residence, that the specific sightlines claimed by the peeping servants were physically and geometrically impossible. He meticulously proved that a carriage driver could not have possibly seen what he claimed to have seen at the specific late hour of the night he stated, basing this counter-argument entirely on the historical data of lunar illumination and the exact placement of municipal gas street lamps on that specific date. It was a grueling, highly technical, and emotionally draining deconstruction of the plaintiff's primary case. O'Connor was not attempting to prove Catherine's absolute innocence in these early, volatile stages. He was executing a deliberate strategy designed solely to introduce massive reasonable doubt regarding the structural integrity of Edwin's manufactured evidence. He successfully transformed the trial from a moralistic judgment on Catherine into a rigorous, highly critical audit of Edwin's extreme investigative methods. He forced the jury of 12 men to seriously question whether they were hearing the absolute objective truth or merely witnessing a carefully purchased, highly theatrical script directed by the wealthiest actor in America. However, Dismantling the false testimonies of the household staff was only the first necessary phase of O'Connor's grand legal strategy. Even if he could successfully cast deep doubt on the servants, the physical evidence of the Consuelo letter still hung heavily over the courtroom like an impending execution. The viewing public firmly believed that the letter alone was more than enough to secure Edwin's total victory and destroy Catherine's life forever. Forrest sat comfortably at the plaintiff's table, radiating absolute confidence, fully believing his immense wealth and public fame had successfully engineered a perfect, inescapable legal trap. He had absolutely no idea that Charles O'Connor had spent the previous 6 months conducting his own incredibly secretive, parallel investigation. While Edwin was focused entirely on destroying his wife's public reputation, O'Connor had been quietly, methodically tracking Edwin's own movements through the darkest, most illicit corners of New York City. As the plaintiff's formidable team finally rested their supposedly airtight case, expecting a swift and total capitulation, Charles O'Connor slowly stood up, adjusted his spectacles, and prepared to introduce a completely unexpected legal doctrine into the proceedings, one that involved a highly secretive financial ledger and a specific, notorious address in the Five Points district that would instantly turn the beloved American idol into the desperate accused. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as Charles O'Connor stepped into the center of the room, completely shattering the meticulously crafted illusion of Edwin Forrest's moral superiority. To understand the sheer destructive power of what O'Connor was about to do, we must analyze a highly specific, fundamentally crucial tenet of 19th-century family law known as the doctrine of recrimination. In the rigid legal landscape of 1851 New York, divorce was not merely a dispute over assets, it was an absolute moral judgment. The doctrine of recrimination dictated that if a plaintiff sued their spouse for divorce on the grounds of adultery, but the defense could legally prove that the plaintiff had also committed adultery, the court would instantly dismiss the entire case. It was the legal equivalent of mutually assured destruction. If both parties were found guilty of violating the marital contract, the state essentially washed its hands of the matter, refusing to grant a divorce to a guilty party. O'Connor knew that completely exonerating Catherine in the eyes of a highly conservative, all-male jury was a nearly impossible uphill battle given the sheer volume of manufactured testimonies against her. Therefore, he pivoted to an aggressive, overwhelming counteroffensive. He did not just need to prove Catherine was innocent. He needed to prove that Edwin Forrest was a prolific, undeniable hypocrite. O'Connor began by introducing a series of deeply uncomfortable financial records, specifically a completely unexpected, highly secretive ledger obtained through relentless back-channel investigations. He directed the jury's attention far away from the opulent mansions of the elite and pointed it directly toward the Five Points district of Lower Manhattan. At the time, the Five Points was globally notorious as one of the most dangerous, disease-ridden, and poverty-stricken slums in the Western Hemisphere. It was a chaotic labyrinth of illegal gambling dens, violent gang territories, and shadowy brothels, representing the absolute antithesis of the refined, fiercely patriotic public image Edwin Forrest projected from the stage of the nearby Astor Place Opera House. O'Connor meticulously detailed, line by line, date by date, how Forrest had been a frequent paying patron of a specific high-end house of ill repute situated on the very edge of this notorious neighborhood. The ledger recorded payments that correlated exactly with the nights Catherine had been left alone in their massive estate, effectively destroying the narrative of the devoted, betrayed husband. Imagine if we examine a parallel situation in the year 2026 to fully grasp the catastrophic impact of this revelation. Imagine a beloved, highly successful American tech billionaire, let us call him Jonathan Vance, who has spent months aggressively destroying his wife's public brand in a heavily publicized divorce trial, accusing her of financial impropriety and demanding full custody of children. Suddenly, her legal defense team introduces a fully authenticated, heavily encrypted blockchain ledger subpoenaed from a digital forensic firm. This ledger proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Jonathan Vance has been systematically funneling millions of dollars into highly illegal, offshore syndicates and unregulated vice markets for years. The instantaneous destruction of his public brand, the immediate crash of his company stock, and the total loss of all moral high ground in the courtroom would be absolute. The potential outcomes of such a revelation today mirror exactly the historical trends set by the Forrest trial. The public absolutely loves a righteous victim, but they ruthlessly despise a wealthy, arrogant hypocrite. But Charles O'Connor did not stop at anonymous encounters in the 5 Points. He understood that to truly break Edwin's iron grip on the jury, he needed to introduce a named, highly recognizable co-conspirator. He brought forward explosive, highly corroborated allegations regarding Edwin's long-standing, intensely private relationship with Josephine Clifton, a physically imposing, widely famous actress who frequently co-starred with Forrest on his national tours. O'Connor produced hotel registries, train compartment booking records, and eyewitness accounts from highly credible transportation staff that placed Forrest and Clifton in explicitly compromising, thoroughly unchaperoned situations across multiple states. O'Connor was intentionally weaponizing the extreme societal double standards of the Victorian era. Society routinely turned a blind eye to the quiet indiscretions of powerful men, as long as they remained firmly in the shadows. However, by dragging these indiscretions into the blinding, unforgiving light of a highly publicized legal proceeding, O'Connor forced the jury to confront the ugly, undeniable truth of the situation. The psychological shift in the courtroom was palpable and immediate. Edwin Forrest, who had spent the first 2 weeks of the trial sitting at the plaintiff's table with absolute, arrogant confidence, frequently sneering at Catherine and loudly scoffing at the defense, was now visibly enraged. His face flushed with unchecked anger. His massive theatrical frame tense with the realization that he was losing control of the narrative. The penny press reporters, sensing a much more lucrative and scandalous storyline, completely flipped their editorial angles overnight. The daily newspapers that had previously painted Forrest as a tragic, betrayed American hero suddenly began running massive headlines questioning his integrity, his fidelity, and his basic honor. Catherine, conversely, maintained a completely stoic, unwavering composure throughout the entire ordeal. Her quiet dignity, juxtaposed against her husband's exploding temper and newly exposed depravity, slowly began to salvage her devastated reputation. Through sheer tactical brilliance, Charles O'Connor had successfully neutralized the emotional momentum of the plaintiff's case. He had successfully utilized historical case studies of recrimination to stall the immediate execution of Catherine's social standing. However, introducing reasonable doubt and exposing Edwin's hypocrisy was ultimately a defensive maneuver. It leveled the playing field, but it did not win the war. O'Connor still faced a monumental, seemingly insurmountable legal obstacle. He had successfully damaged the credibility of the domestic servants and exposed the plaintiff's own infidelity, but he still had to deal with the most dangerous radioactive piece of physical evidence in the entire trial. The Consuelo letter still sat on the judge's bench, a stark, undeniable piece of paper written by a young actor, explicitly confessing deep romantic feelings for Catherine. If O'Connor could not completely explain away the existence and the incredibly damning contents of that specific correspondence, the jury, bound by the strict legal parameters of the era, would likely simply rule them both legally guilty of adultery. Such a verdict would leave Catherine completely penniless, legally tethered to a man who despised her, and permanently destroyed in high society anyway. How exactly does a lawyer take a piece of physical evidence that explicitly points to a highly illicit affair and magically convince 12 deeply conservative, highly skeptical men that it means the exact opposite? How do you defuse a legal bomb? You meticulously and systematically dismantle its triggering mechanism piece by piece. Charles O'Connor knew with absolute certainty that he could not deny the physical existence of the Consuelo letter. The paper was real, the ink was dry, George Jameson absolutely wrote it, and Catherine Forrest undoubtedly possessed it. But O'Connor understood a fundamental, highly nuanced principle of legal interpretation that remains incredibly vital in modern civil litigation. Physical possession does not intrinsically equal active participation or mutual consent. To break the spell the letter had cast over the jury, O'Connor had to completely reframe the cultural and psychological context of the document. He began by plunging the courtroom into the highly stylized, dramatically exaggerated world of 19th-century theatrical correspondence. Actors in this era did not communicate like regular citizens. They spoke and wrote in sweeping, hyper-romantic dialogues, constantly practicing their craft and blurring the lines between their stage personas and their private lives. O'Connor painstakingly educated the jury on the specific literary reference that gave the letter its name. Consuelo was the title of a wildly popular, highly melodramatic French novel written by George Sand. The novel tells the sweeping story of a brilliantly talented, morally pure, and fiercely independent female singer, who successfully navigates a deeply corrupt and dangerous world without ever compromising her ultimate virtue. O'Connor completely flipped the narrative script. He argued passionately that Jameson, a vastly inferior actor who was desperately hungry for attention, patronage, and career advancement from the wealthy Forrest family, was simply engaging in a pathetic, unsolicited attempt at literary roleplay. O'Connor cast George Jameson not as a successful dashing seducer who had conquered the wife of a titan, but as a ridiculous, overstepping, socially awkward pest. He took the letter from the judge's bench and read it aloud to the jury, agonizingly analyzing the text line by line. He pointed out, with devastating logical clarity, that the letter contained absolutely no references to any past physical encounters. There was no logistical planning for future secret meetings, no shared inside jokes, and absolutely no tangible evidence of a reciprocated, two-sided relationship. It was purely an unsolicited, obsessive monologue written by a man projecting his own theatrical fantasies onto a woman who simply happened to be in his vicinity. Imagine if we take this exact evidentiary dilemma and transplant it directly into the current year 2026. Consider a highly successful, universally recognized American lifestyle influencer. Let us call her Sarah Jenkins. During a bitter, high-stakes, multi-million-dollar divorce proceeding, her estranged husband attempts to destroy her character by presenting a heavily publicized screenshot of an incredibly explicit, emotionally charged direct message sent to Sarah's private digital inbox by a completely unhinged former business collaborator. The message is graphic, obsessive, and implies a deep, ongoing secret connection. The internet immediately assumes absolute guilt based purely on the shocking nature of the text. But what if Sarah's defense attorney successfully proved through meticulous digital forensic auditing that she never once replied, never engaged, and simply ignored the message amidst tens of thousands of other daily notifications? The potential outcomes of presenting unreciprocated, one-sided digital communication as concrete evidence of physical infidelity are remarkably fragile when subjected to rigorous, objective scrutiny. The historical trends established in 1851 mirror our exact current understanding of digital stalking, unsolicited contact, and parasocial obsession. One person's obsessive outreach does not automatically criminalize the person receiving it. Building upon this crucial distinction, O'Connor hammered a secondary, equally devastating point regarding Catherine's complete lack of a reply and her incredibly careless handling of the document. If Catherine Forrest were truly engaged in a highly dangerous, illicit affair that risked her entire societal existence, her vast wealth, and her physical safety, why on earth would she casually leave such a devastating, supposedly incriminating piece of evidence sitting completely unprotected in an unlocked drawer in her home? O'Connor argued that true criminals who are actively harboring deep guilt go to extreme, paranoid lengths to burn, destroy, or hide physical evidence of their transgressions. O'Connor painted Catherine's casual retention of the Consuelo letter as absolute, undeniable proof of her complete and total innocence. She kept it in an unlocked drawer precisely because the letter meant absolutely nothing to her. It was a bizarre, mildly amusing curiosity, a piece of trash discarded and entirely forgotten by a woman whose conscience was perfectly clear. Furthermore, O'Connor launched a fierce, highly calculated attack on the deeply suspicious manner in which Edwin Forrest claimed to have discovered this supposed smoking gun. O'Connor meticulously cross-examined Edwin's established timeline of discovery, utilizing historical data of the couple's travel schedules and domestic routines. Edwin claimed he found the letter months before he actually initiated the formal separation proceedings. O'Connor loudly demanded the jury ask themselves a vital question. Why did this famously volatile, physically aggressive man wait so long to act if he truly believed he had just uncovered proof of his wife's betrayal? O'Connor suggested a chilling, highly calculated counter-narrative to the jury. He proposed that Edwin Forrest, who had already been proven to be engaging in multiple seedy affairs of his own, was desperately seeking a legal mechanism to discard his aging wife without losing his massive fortune to alimony. O'Connor argued that Edwin actively and maliciously facilitated situations where Catherine would be socially compromised. He purposefully cultivated the constant presence of younger men like Jameson in his home, essentially setting an elaborate psychological trap. When a physical affair completely failed to materialize because Catherine remained faithful, Edwin seized upon the unsolicited letter as a desperate, completely manufactured pretext for a fraudulent divorce. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the terrifying, undeniable smoking gun was slowly and methodically reduced to a pathetic, unsolicited piece of theatrical fan fiction. O'Connor's brilliant legal reframing completely transformed Catherine from a deceptive, manipulative adulteress into the unfortunate target of an obsessive younger man, and the ultimate victim of a deeply paranoid, highly scheming husband. The absolute strategic genius of this maneuver was that it perfectly aligned with the dominant Victorian archetype of the pure, helpless woman unfairly besieged by predatory, aggressive men. It was a masterstroke of psychological manipulation tailored flawlessly for the exact prejudices and protective instincts of that specific all-male jury. But while the threat of the Consuelo letter was effectively neutralized in the courtroom, the overall trial was far from reaching its conclusion. Edwin Forrest, suddenly realizing that his primary, supposedly unbeatable weapon had been completely disarmed by an obscure lawyer, grew increasingly volatile, erratic, and profoundly desperate. He recognized that he was rapidly losing control of the sterile legal environment. Therefore, he decided to completely abandon traditional courtroom decorum and leverage his ultimate, terrifying advantage: his absolute, unquestioned domination of the working-class American theatrical audience. If he could not win his case purely through civil legal proceedings, he would intentionally incite a literal violent riot in the streets of New York to force a favorable verdict through sheer intimidation. How exactly does a wealthy celebrity weaponize mass mob violence and violent class warfare to influence the outcome of a private civil divorce trial? To fully comprehend the terrifying mechanism of this strategy, we must step back and examine the historical trends of New York City, just 2 years prior to this trial. In 1849, Edwin Forrest was at the absolute center of the deadliest civic uprising in American theatrical history, known as the Astor Place Riot. Forrest had cultivated an intense, bitter, and highly publicized rivalry with the refined British actor named William Charles Macready. Forrest deliberately positioned himself as the muscular, unapologetic champion of the American working class, while casting Macready as the ultimate symbol of oppressive, aristocratic British elitism. When Macready attempted to perform in New York, Forrest subtly encouraged his massive fan base, heavily comprised of nativist street gangs known as the Bowery Buoys, to physically disrupt the performance. This orchestrated harassment rapidly escalated into a full-scale riot outside the Astor Place Opera House. The state militia was called in, they fired directly into the crowd, and over 20 people were left dead in the streets. While the city mourned, Edwin Forrest learned a profoundly dangerous lesson about power. He realized that his personal grievances seamlessly translated into violent class warfare, and that his loyal working-class audience was entirely willing to shed blood on his behalf. When the divorce trial commenced in 1851, Forrest actively executed a chilling repetition of this exact strategy, but this time the target was his own wife. Catherine Forrest was born in England. She was highly educated, possessed a refined accent, and spent her marriage hosting sophisticated literary salons for intellectuals and poets. Edwin Forrest intentionally weaponized these traits. He instructed his legal team and his highly paid allies in the penny press to completely rebrand the domestic dispute into an existential battle for American values. The daily newspapers, firmly under Forrest's influence, began running sensationalized editorials portraying Catherine not just as an unfaithful spouse, but as a treacherous, elitist foreigner who looked down upon the hard-working American public. Forrest successfully transposed the exact same virulent, anti-British, anti-aristocratic hatred that had fueled the deadly Astor Place riot directly onto the shoulders of a single woman standing trial in a civil court. Let us examine a potential outcome of this exact dynamic by looking at a modern parallel in the year 2026. Imagine a vastly popular, highly controversial internet personality, an independent media mogul named Jackson Vance. Vance possesses an audience of millions of hyper-engaged, deeply loyal followers who view him as the ultimate anti-establishment truth-teller. If Vance enters a highly contentious public divorce and custody battle, he would not need to directly ask his audience to commit crimes. Instead, utilizing modern dog whistle tactics, Vance would simply complain on his daily broadcast that his wife is colluding with corrupt institutional elites to silence him. The immediate historical trends of digital behavior dictate that his rabid fan base would instantly deploy decentralized, stochastic terrorism. They would systematically dox the presiding judge, orchestrate massive, coordinated swatting attacks against his wife's legal team, and flood the social media accounts of any potential witnesses with explicit death threats. Jackson Vance could sit back, claiming complete plausible deniability, while his mobilized mob completely terrorizes the legal system into submission. This modern scenario is the precise psychological equivalent of what Edwin Forrest orchestrated in 1851. The New York courthouse was physically surrounded by hundreds of aggressive, highly agitated young men wearing the signature red shirts and soapbox of the nativist street gangs. They packed the public galleries to absolute capacity, creating an atmosphere of sheer terror. Whenever Forrest entered the room, they erupted in deafening cheers. Whenever Charles O'Connor or Catherine Forrest stood to speak, they were met with aggressive hissing, vicious verbal insults, and thinly veiled physical threats. The intimidation was not merely theatrical. It was a highly calculated, structural assault on the integrity of the judicial process. The New York Police Department was in its absolute infancy during this era, severely underfunded, deeply corrupt, and completely incapable of controlling a mob of that magnitude. You must place yourself in the exact psychological position of the 12 men sitting on that jury. These were not powerful politicians or wealthy elites. They were ordinary tradesmen, local merchants, and middle-class citizens who relied entirely on the local community for their physical safety and their economic survival. They knew with absolute certainty that the men screaming in the gallery were the exact same men who had burned buildings and fought the state militia just 2 years prior. The implicit threat hanging over the courtroom was devastatingly clear. If this jury dared to deliver a verdict against the beloved champion of the working class, their shops could be mysteriously burned to the ground, their physical safety on the streets would be compromised, and their lives would be completely destroyed by the mob. Edwin Forrest was not just relying on his highly paid domestic spies or the fabricated Consuelo letter anymore. He was holding the entire jury hostage through the looming threat of imminent domestic terrorism. This horrifying environment completely altered the landscape of the trial. Charles O'Connor realized that winning the case on purely legal or evidentiary grounds was no longer sufficient. It did not matter if he proved Catherine was innocent if the jury was simply too terrified to publicly declare it. O'Connor had to execute a breathtakingly difficult psychological maneuver. He had to figure out a way to appeal to the jury's deep-seated American pride, successfully convincing them that cowering to a violent mob was a far greater betrayal of their patriotic duty than ruling against the nation's most famous actor. He needed to reframe Edwin Forrest not as the champion of the people, but as a tyrannical, unchecked dictator utilizing the tactics of a European king to subjugate the American legal system. As the exhaustive, grueling weeks of the trial finally drew to a close, the tension inside the courthouse reached a boiling point. The physical exhaustion of the legal teams, the suffocating heat of the overcrowded room, and the relentless, suffocating pressure of the violent mob outside had pushed everyone to their absolute breaking point. The evidentiary phase of the trial officially concluded, setting the stage for the final, monumental closing arguments. Charles O'Connor spent sleepless nights painstakingly crafting an incredibly dangerous, high-wire legal argument that would challenge the mob directly to their faces. He prepared to deliver a speech that would either secure Catherine's total liberation or ignite a second, even more destructive civic riot. But right before O'Connor could stand up to deliver the most critical and defining monologue of his entire legal career, Edwin Forrest, blinded by his own absolute arrogance and completely misreading the emotional temperature of the room, made one final catastrophic miscalculation. What fatal, irreversible error did the greatest actor of his generation commit in plain sight of the terrified jury that would completely shatter his invincible facade and change the course of American legal history forever? The fatal error was born of absolute, unchecked hubris. Edwin Forrest, a man entirely accustomed to dictating reality from the center of a stage and demanding absolute submission from everyone in his orbit, simply could not handle the excruciating reality of Charles O'Connor's methodical, deeply public dismantling of his massive ego. As O'Connor relentlessly cross-examined one of Forrest's final, highly compensated private investigators, systematically tearing apart a completely fabricated timeline regarding a supposed secret rendezvous, Forrest finally erupted. Instead of maintaining the stoic, dignified posture of a profoundly wronged and grieving husband, the muscular titan of the American theater leaped from his chair in a blind rage. His face turned a deep, alarming shade of purple. He violently slammed his massive fists onto the heavy wooden plaintiff table, a sound that shattered the suffocating, tense silence of the packed courtroom like a gunshot. Forrest unleashed a sudden, terrifying barrage of profanity and direct, visceral verbal threats, aimed explicitly at both Charles O'Connor and his own wife, Catherine. This was absolutely not a calculated theatrical performance designed to sway the crowd. This was raw, unhinged domestic tyranny bleeding irreversibly into the permanent public record. In that single explosive moment of unchecked aggression, Edwin Forrest completely destroyed his own carefully curated, highly expensive public relations campaign. He visually proved to the terrified jury every single disturbing allegation that Charles O'Connor had meticulously built over the preceding 33 days of exhaustive testimony. The jury suddenly saw the actual terrifying reality of Edwin Forrest. He was not the deeply patriotic, honorable American hero defending his home from a corrupt, aristocratic interloper. He was an incredibly volatile, dangerous, and deeply paranoid abuser who believed he was entirely above the constraints of the law. Imagine if we transplant this precise courtroom dynamic into a contemporary setting in the year 2026 to fully comprehend the sheer destructive magnitude of this moment. Picture a high-stakes, heavily televised defamation and asset division trial involving a notoriously aggressive technology billionaire. Let us call him Marcus Thorne. Thorne's entire legal strategy, funded by millions of dollars in highly specialized crisis management teams, rests entirely on presenting himself as a calm, fiercely rational and objective innovator who is being unjustly extorted by a vindictive former spouse. However, during the most critical, highly scrutinized cross-examination phase, Thorne completely snaps under the relentless pressure of the opposing counsel. He violently throws his microphone across the room, screams aggressively at the presiding judge, and visibly attempts to lunge across the courtroom floor toward the defense table. The potential outcomes of such a visceral, undeniable public meltdown are instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. Historical trends in courtroom psychology, alongside modern data regarding jury behavior, consistently demonstrate that a panel of jurors might struggle to comprehend complex financial forensics, but they will never, ever forgive or forget a direct, terrifying display of uncontrollable physical aggression in a sacred judicial space. Marcus Thorne would lose his case the exact millisecond he lost his temper, entirely regardless of any digital evidence his team had previously presented. His corporate stock would plummet, his board of directors would instantly sever ties, and his meticulously constructed public narrative would disintegrate permanently. Charles O'Connor, a master tactician of the highest order, instantly recognized that Forrest had just miraculously handed him the final, missing piece of his complex defensive puzzle. As Forrest was finally physically restrained by court officers and sternly ordered to sit down by a furious Chief Justice Thomas Oakley, O'Connor did not shrink away or request a recess. He capitalized on the shockwave immediately. He slowly turned his back on the disgraced actor and faced the 12 deeply shaken men sitting rigidly in the jury box. O'Connor did not yell. He deliberately lowered his voice to a near whisper, forcing the jury to lean forward collectively, effectively isolating their attention and pulling them entirely away from the roaring, dangerous mob waiting outside the courthouse walls. O'Connor's closing argument is still revered in historical legal circles today as an absolute masterclass in psychological manipulation, risk reversal, and patriotic framing. He explicitly addressed the terrifying elephant in the room, the deafening roar of the Bowery buoys surrounding the building, demanding a victory for Forrest. O'Connor acknowledged the jury's completely legitimate fear. He validated their intense anxiety regarding potential mob violence, personal property damage, and severe social retribution in their local neighborhoods. But then, he executed a brilliant paradigm-shifting pivot. He legally and emotionally cornered them by appealing directly to their foundational sense of American identity and civic duty. He argued passionately that true courage was not found in the chaotic, physical aggression of the lawless mob outside, but in the quiet, steadfast, and incredibly dangerous adherence to the rule of law inside that specific jury box. He challenged their manhood and their patriotism directly. He essentially asked them if they were free, independent American citizens capable of discerning objective truth through evidence, or if they were simply terrified, easily manipulated subjects cowering beneath the violent, tyrannical whims of an arrogant theatrical king. He masterfully framed ruling in favor of Catherine not merely as an act of saving a wronged, destitute woman, but as a crucial, desperately necessary defense of the American justice system itself. If they allowed Edwin Forrest's wealth and his mobilized street gangs to successfully intimidate them into delivering a fraudulent guilty verdict, O'Connor argued, then the Democratic courts of New York were utterly useless and violent, wealthy anarchists truly ruled the nation. It was an immense, crushing psychological burden to place squarely on the shoulders of 12 ordinary tradesmen and merchants. O'Connor made it abundantly, terrifyingly clear that their impending verdict would not just decide the financial fate of the Forrest marriage. It would set an enduring, permanent historical precedent regarding the absolute limits of celebrity power, weaponized wealth, and class warfare in the United States. He asked them to look closely at Catherine, who had sat flawlessly composed, maintaining her absolute dignity through 33 grueling days of the most degrading public humiliation imaginable, and then to look at Edwin, who had just tried to violently subvert the authority of the court itself. When Chief Justice Oakley finally delivered his exhaustive, highly complex jury instructions, effectively summarizing the massive labyrinth of contradictory evidence, manufactured testimonies, and the strict legal doctrines of recrimination, The historical trends of the era suggested a rapid capitulation. Given the extreme threat of civic unrest looming heavily over the courthouse, many expected the jury to simply return a quick, compromised verdict to appease the angry crowds and escape with their lives. However, the jury did not rush. They were heavily escorted by armed guards to a secure deliberation room, completely cut off from the chaotic, freezing January night. Hours turned into an agonizingly long, completely silent wait. Outside, the massive crowds grew increasingly volatile, lighting bonfires in the streets, eagerly anticipating the total destruction of Catherine Forrest. Inside the courtroom, the tension was absolutely suffocating. Edwin paced frantically like a caged animal, his earlier arrogance replaced by a creeping paranoid dread. Catherine remained entirely motionless, her survival hanging entirely by a thread, completely dependent on the extraordinary courage of 12 men she did not know. And then, finally, the heavy wooden door of the deliberation room swung open. The foreman stepped forward, clutching a single piece of paper containing the answers to the judge's highly specific factual interrogatories. What they were about to read aloud would not only cause Edwin Forrest to collapse in total, unprecedented shock, but it would unleash a financial and legal earthquake so massive that the tremors are still actively felt in modern family law courts today. What was the exact, mind-blowing nature of this historical verdict? The foreman of the jury stood in the stifling, completely silent courtroom and held up the single sheet of paper containing the formal answers to the specific factual interrogatories demanded by Chief Justice Thomas Oakley. The historical trends of 19th-century jurisprudence dictated that juries in these complex domestic disputes did not simply deliver a blanket verdict of innocent or guilty. Instead, they were required to answer a highly specific, legally binding questionnaire designed to establish absolute fault. The foreman cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly under the immense weight of the moment and the terrifying knowledge of the violent mob waiting just outside the courthouse doors. He read the first interrogatory. Did Catherine Sinclair Forrest commit adultery with George Jameson or any other man? The answer, delivered with ringing clarity, was a definitive, unanimous no. The entire courtroom audibly gasped. The supposedly undeniable physical evidence of the Consuelo letter, the highly paid testimonies of the household staff, and the immense social weight of America's greatest actor had all been completely neutralized. But the jury was not finished. The foreman proceeded to the second, far more explosive interrogatory. Did Edwin Forrest commit adultery with Josephine Clifton or any other woman? The foreman looked directly at the aggressively posturing actor and delivered the second unanimous answer. Yes. In less than 60 seconds, the entire social and legal hierarchy of the American theater had been completely inverted. Catherine Forrest was fully exonerated of all charges, legally retaining her virtue, her societal standing, and her dignity. Edwin Forrest, the beloved, fiercely patriotic champion of the working-class American male, was officially branded by a court of his peers as a legally documented adulterer and a perjurer who had attempted to subvert the justice system with manufactured evidence. But the psychological devastation of the verdict was merely the preamble to the actual physical punishment that Chief Justice Oakley was about to inflict upon Edwin Forrest's massive financial empire. Because Catherine was entirely absolved of fault and Edwin was legally declared the guilty party, the court granted Catherine a complete, absolute divorce, severing all legal ties to her abuser. But more importantly, the court had to determine the financial separation of their highly lucrative partnership. Historical trends regarding alimony in 1852 were profoundly bleak for women. If a woman received any financial support at all, it was typically a meager, absolute minimum stipend designed merely to keep her out of the municipal poorhouses. It was almost never designed to maintain the opulent lifestyle she had enjoyed during the marriage. However, recognizing the sheer scale of Edwin's malice, his vast, aggressively accumulated wealth, and the unprecedented public humiliation he had intentionally subjected Catherine to, the court delivered a ruling that fundamentally changed the trajectory of American family law. Chief Justice Oakley awarded Catherine Forrest an astronomical alimony of $3,000 per year, to be paid in perpetuity. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of this specific financial ruling, we must contextualize the data within the era. In 1852, a highly skilled, fully employed American tradesman might earn approximately $300 for an entire year of backbreaking labor. The court had just ordered Edwin Forrest to pay his fiercely hated ex-wife 10 times the average national salary every single year for the rest of her natural life. This was not merely spousal support. This was a highly calculated, legally mandated punitive measure designed to financially bleed a man who believed his wealth placed him entirely above the law. This specific ruling established a profound, enduring precedent in the United States legal system. It cemented the concept that a wronged spouse in a high-net-worth marriage is legally entitled to maintain the standard of living established during the union, and that weaponized financial abuse will be actively punished by the state. Imagine if we analyze this exact legal mechanism through a modern lens in the year 2026. Consider a scenario involving a massively successful, highly aggressive American technology mogul named Richard Sterling. Sterling initiates a brutal, highly publicized divorce against his wife of 20 years, utilizing expensive public relations firms to paint her as unstable and financially incompetent, attempting to force her into accepting a severely undervalued settlement. However, her forensic accounting team successfully proves in open court that Sterling has been hiding hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore shell companies while actively engaging in multiple infidelities. The potential outcomes in modern family law courts directly mirrored the Forrest precedent. A modern judge in 2026 would not simply divide the visible assets. They would likely award the wronged spouse a massive, disproportionate share of the estate and a staggering monthly support mandate as a direct, punitive response to the financial deception and the bad faith litigation tactics. The absolute destruction of Richard Sterling's financial leverage in this scenario is exactly what happened to Edwin Forrest. When the verdict and the financial award were officially recorded, the reaction was seismic. The massive, agitated crowd of Bowery buoys surrounding the courthouse, eagerly anticipating the total destruction of the elitist British wife, fell into a state of profound, disorganized shock. The definitive nature of the verdict and the sheer bravery of the jury completely paralyzed the mob, preventing the violent civic uprising that everyone had feared. Edwin Forrest sat entirely frozen at the plaintiff's table. His massive muscular frame seemed to instantly deflate. The man who had meticulously engineered the destruction of his wife had just orchestrated his own permanent public humiliation and a massive financial hemorrhage. However, anyone who assumed that this historic verdict marked the end of the conflict completely misunderstood the deeply pathological psychology of Edwin Forrest. A man characterized by such profound narcissism and unchecked public adulation simply does not accept legal defeat. As Catherine Forrest finally walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by a heavy police escort but holding her head high as a fully vindicated, financially independent woman, Edwin was already pivoting his strategy. He realized that while he had decisively lost the moral and evidentiary battle in the civil courtroom, he still possessed a virtually unlimited war chest of capital. He immediately fired his entire legal team and hired a new, incredibly aggressive firm specializing in appellate law. If Forrest could not win based on the actual facts of the case, he decided he would utilize his vast fortune to completely overwhelm the justice system through sheer financial attrition. This marked the beginning of a completely new, far more insidious phase of legal warfare known as lawfare. Edwin categorically refused to pay a single cent of the $3,000 annual alimony ordered by the Supreme Court. Instead, he weaponized the incredibly slow, highly bureaucratic, and deeply flawed appeals process of the 19th century. By filing endless, highly technical legal motions, demanding continuous days of execution, and aggressively contesting every single minor procedural detail of the original 33-day trial, Edwin successfully froze the court order. Catherine, despite winning the greatest legal victory in American domestic history, suddenly found herself completely destitute, unable to access the funds legally awarded to her, while her ex-husband continued to earn massive fortunes touring the country and playing the role of the tragically wronged hero to his adoring audiences. How exactly does a woman with a historic Supreme Court victory, but zero actual dollars in her bank account survive a decade-long legal siege against an opponent with infinite resources? And what incredibly dangerous, highly controversial profession does Catherine Forrest turn to in a desperate bid to fund her own legal defense? A decision that would completely scandalize New York society all over again. The answer to Catherine Forrest's desperate financial dilemma was an absolute masterstroke of both survival and strategic retaliation. In a decision that sent massive shockwaves through the rigid social hierarchies of 19th century New York, Catherine decided to step directly onto the exact same battlefield that her ex-husband had dominated for decades. She became a professional actress. To fully comprehend the sheer scandal of this career pivot, we must analyze the historical trends regarding the extreme societal stigmatization of women in the theater during the 1850s. In this highly puritanical era, high society universally viewed the acting profession as morally bankrupt, fundamentally lacking in respectability, and dangerously close to sex work. For a refined, aristocratic British woman, who had previously hosted elite literary salons to willingly charge the general public for the privilege of gazing upon her body and listening to her voice was considered an unthinkable degradation. It was an absolute social suicide. However, Catherine fundamentally understood a brilliant, cold economic reality. She was no longer a respected society wife, she was the most famously notorious woman in North America, and infamy, when properly managed, is an incredibly lucrative commodity. To survive the brutal legal siege initiated by Edwin, Catherine required a staggering amount of capital. Edwin was executing a classic campaign of financial lawfare, a strategy built entirely on attrition. By filing endless injunctions, demanding highly technical appellate reviews, and securing continuous stays of execution against the court-ordered alimony payments, Edwin effectively weaponized the bureaucratic slowness of the New York State legal system. His goal was not necessarily to win the appeals, but simply to starve his ex-wife into total submission or physical collapse. Charles O'Connor, her brilliant attorney, was fiercely dedicated to her cause, but fighting the wealthiest actor in America required vast sums for ongoing court filings, private investigators, daily transcripts, and specialized legal clerks. Catherine could not rely on the non-existent social safety nets of the era. Therefore, she deliberately commercialized her own destroyed reputation to fund her fight for justice. Let us examine this precise dynamic through a modern lens by utilizing an imagine-if scenario set in the current year 2026. Imagine a high-profile, devastatingly public divorce involving an incredibly powerful American media conglomerate CEO. Let us call him Marcus Vance. Vance aggressively freezes all marital assets, leaving his ex-wife, Elena, completely destitute while burying her in millions of dollars of retaliatory corporate litigation. To survive, Elena decides to launch a highly controversial, completely uncensored digital subscription platform, directly competing in the exact same media space as her billionaire ex-husband. She monetizes the immense public fascination with her destroyed marriage, hosting live broadcasts where she dissects the ongoing legal battle. The potential outcomes of this modern scenario directly mirror Catherine's historical strategy. The public, driven by an insatiable appetite for controversy and voyeurism, would flood her platform with subscription revenue. By leaning directly into the scandal, Elena would completely circumvent her ex-husband's financial blockade, generating an independent fortune to fund her own elite legal defense. This is exactly the economic mechanism Catherine Forrest weaponized in 1852. She made her highly anticipated theatrical debut at Brugham's Lyceum in New York City, deliberately choosing to star as Lady Teazle in the classic play The School for Scandal. The meta-narrative was incredibly sharp and deeply calculated. She was starring in a play entirely focused on the destructive nature of high society gossip and ruined reputations. The tension leading up to the opening night was absolutely suffocating. Edwin's loyal supporters, the violent nativist street gangs known as the Bowery Boys, loudly threatened to burn the theater to the ground if she dared to take the stage. The municipal police force had to physically barricade the surrounding streets to prevent another deadly civic riot. Yet, when the curtain finally rose, the theater was packed to absolute capacity with a completely different demographic. Thousands of sympathetic citizens, fascinated by her resilience and eager to witness the woman who had publicly defeated Edwin Forrest, bought tickets at premium, highly inflated prices. Catherine was not universally praised as a brilliant artistic talent, but her debut was an absolute, undeniable financial triumph. She successfully converted the massive, highly toxic public attention generated by her divorce trial directly into a highly lucrative stream of independent revenue. But Catherine did not merely stop at acting in New York. Recognizing the immense potential for wealth expansion, she studied historical trends of the American frontier and took her newfound career all the way to California during the absolute height of the gold rush. In a landscape dominated entirely by aggressive, fortune-seeking men, Catherine Forrest transformed herself from an isolated, legally battered ex-wife into one of the very first female theater managers in the history of the United States. She successfully managed the Sinclair Theater in San Francisco, negotiating complex financial contracts, directing massive stage productions, and securing a level of absolute financial independence that completely insulated her from Edwin's ongoing legal warfare back on the East Coast. The psychological impact of Catherine's massive success upon Edwin Forrest was completely devastating. He had explicitly designed a legal strategy to push her into the gutters of New York, expecting her to quietly perish from poverty and social exile. Instead, he inadvertently forced her into becoming a powerful, highly successful entrepreneur who was actively beating him at his own theatrical game. Case studies of extreme financial abuse in historical divorce proceedings frequently highlight the sheer fragility of the victims, but Catherine Forrest represents a spectacular outlier. She utilized the exact instruments of her public destruction as the foundational building blocks of a completely new, fiercely independent empire. Every single time Edwin filed a new, highly expensive appeal in the New York Supreme Court, Catherine simply sold out another massive theater in San Francisco, happily wiring the necessary legal fees directly to Charles O'Connor to counter her ex-husband's relentless attacks. For over a decade, this bizarre, high-stakes transatlantic legal war raged on. The New York Court of Appeals heard the Forrest case an astonishing 6 separate times, a testament to Edwin's absolute, obsessive refusal to admit defeat and his willingness to burn his own massive fortune just to deny Catherine her legal rights. The legal fees for both sides skyrocketed into amounts that would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in today's currency. Catherine had successfully built an impenetrable financial fortress, but the structural integrity of her defense was about to face its most terrifying challenge yet. After years of failing to overturn the verdict through standard appellate procedures, Edwin's newly hired, aggressively calculating legal team uncovered a highly obscure, deeply terrifying 19th-century legal loophole regarding jurisdictional sovereignty and out-of-state residency. They formulated a completely new strategy that did not just threaten to overturn the alimony, but carried the very real, immediate potential outcome of having Catherine Forrest forcibly extradited across state lines and thrown into a deeply corrupt, highly dangerous municipal prison for massive retroactive financial fraud. How exactly does a team of elite lawyers weaponize state borders against a legally vindicated woman? And what desperate maneuver must Charles O'Connor execute to save his client from being legally kidnapped? To understand the sheer legal terror of this new strategy, we must examine the fragmented, highly chaotic nature of the United States judicial system in the 1850s. Before the standardization of family law across federal lines, individual states operated almost like completely independent, sovereign nations when it came to domestic disputes. Edwin Forrest, recognizing with bitter absolute certainty that the New York Supreme Court would never reverse their humiliating verdict or the staggering $3,000 annual alimony, executed a maneuver known today as aggressive forum shopping. He completely abandoned his primary residence in New York, packed up his massive fortune, and relocated across state lines to his birthplace of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Once safely entrenched in a state where he possessed immense political leverage and was practically worshipped as a local deity by the working class, his new legal team initiated a completely separate, parallel divorce proceeding against Catherine. They petitioned the Pennsylvania legislature and courts to grant him an absolute divorce based on the exact same fabricated evidence that had already been entirely debunked in New York. The strategy was a masterpiece of legal malice. If the Pennsylvania courts, deeply biased in favor of their hometown hero, ruled that Catherine was actually the guilty party and granted Edwin his divorce, it would instantly create a catastrophic, unprecedented constitutional crisis. It would result in two contradictory legal realities coexisting simultaneously within the United States. In New York, Catherine was a completely innocent, legally vindicated woman owed a massive fortune and back pay. But in Pennsylvania, she would be officially branded an adulteress and stripped of all financial rights. Furthermore, if Pennsylvania ruled against her, Edwin's lawyers actively planned to weaponize that specific verdict to demand her immediate arrest should she ever cross the state line. They intended to utilize draconian 19th-century debt collection statutes to label her a fraudster, claiming she was illegally demanding money from a Pennsylvania resident under false pretenses. They were actively attempting to transform a civil domestic dispute into a multi-state criminal dragnet, effectively confining her physical movements and destroying her ability to tour as an actress. Let us analyze a potential outcome of this exact type of jurisdictional warfare by looking at a modern parallel in the current year 2026. Imagine a vastly wealthy, highly vindictive American venture capitalist. Let us call him David Sterling. Sterling suffers a crushing multi-million-dollar asset division defeat in a California family court against his ex-wife. Refusing to pay, Sterling immediately moves his physical residency and all liquid assets to a different state with incredibly strict, aggressive domestic asset protection trust laws that specifically shield wealth from out-of-state family court judgments. He then files a new lawsuit in his new home state, claiming the California court lacked proper jurisdiction over his newly formed corporate entities. The potential outcomes of modern forum shopping can completely bankrupt a legally victorious spouse, forcing them to fight entirely new legal battles in hostile out-of-state jurisdictions, while their awarded assets remain perfectly legally shielded behind impenetrable trust structures. Historical trends show that wealthy litigants have consistently used geographical borders as a primary weapon of financial attrition, and Edwin Forrest was the absolute pioneer of this devastating tactic. Charles O'Connor, sitting in his New York office, instantly recognized the terrifying magnitude of this cross-border assault. He knew that if Edwin successfully secured a contradictory verdict in Pennsylvania, the subsequent legal chaos would provide Forrest with the ultimate excuse to indefinitely delay alimony payments for decades, while the conflicting state laws were debated. O'Connor had to execute a brilliant, highly complex federal maneuver. He could not simply argue the facts of the marriage anymore. He had to argue the fundamental structural integrity of the United States Constitution itself. O'Connor immediately filed aggressive injunctions, invoking the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution, which mandates that individual states must respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. He argued passionately before the highest appellate courts that allowing Edwin to effectively erase a valid New York Supreme Court jury verdict, simply by renting an apartment in Philadelphia, would completely dissolve the legal cohesion of the entire nation. This multi-state legal war required an astronomical amount of capital to sustain. O'Connor had to hire specialized constitutional scholars, retain local counsel in Pennsylvania to actively block Edwin's legislative maneuvers, and continuously fight the endless barrage of appeals Forrest was simultaneously filing back in New York. This is precisely where Catherine's highly controversial decision to become a professional actress saved her life. Every single time Edwin's legal team attempted to outspend them, forcing O'Connor to draft massive 100-page appellate briefs, Catherine would book another rigorous theatrical tour through the American West. She utilized her fame to pack theaters from San Francisco to Sacramento, converting the intense public fascination with her survival directly into the necessary legal funds to keep O'Connor fighting. It was a breathtaking display of endurance. Edwin Forrest was attempting to use the vast wealth he had accumulated over a lifetime to crush her, while Catherine was actively matching his financial firepower dollar for dollar by completely dominating the very industry he had trained her to understand. The siege lasted for an agonizing 12 years. From 1851 until 1863, Catherine Forrest did not see a single penny of the massive alimony the court had originally awarded her. Edwin Forrest weaponized every conceivable delay tactic, forcing the case all the way up to the New York Court of Appeals, the highest possible legal authority in the state, completely exhausting his own legal teams in the process. He became a profoundly bitter, intensely paranoid recluse, obsessed entirely with his hatred for the woman who had publicly bested him. His physical health rapidly deteriorated, fueled by unchecked rage and the massive physical toll of his aggressive theatrical performances. His once impenetrable public reputation slowly began to erode as the American public grew increasingly exhausted by his endless, highly vindictive legal crusades. The press, which had once heralded him as a working-class deity, slowly began to view him as a tyrannical, obsessive old man utterly incapable of accepting defeat. Finally, after more than a decade of relentless litigation, hundreds of thousands of dollars completely incinerated in legal fees, and multiple careers permanently altered, the New York Court of Appeals prepared to issue their ultimate, irreversible decision. This ruling would not be subject to any further state-level appeals. It was the absolute end of the road. If the appellate court sided with Edwin, Catherine would lose absolutely everything she had fought for, instantly inheriting massive debts she could never repay. If they sided with Catherine, Edwin would be legally forced to immediately liquidate a massive portion of his estate to pay 12 years of compounding retroactive alimony, plus interest. The entire American legal and theatrical establishment held its breath as the highest judges in the state prepared to deliver the final word on the most explosive domestic dispute of the century. But even in the face of this absolute finality, Edwin Forrest possessed one last, deeply disturbing legal mechanism. He had secretly executed a highly complex legal maneuver regarding his last will and testament, ensuring that even if he lost the final appellate ruling, his absolute hatred for Catherine would physically outlive him. What was this terrifying final trap, and how did it fundamentally change the way modern courts handle post-mortem asset distribution in bitter family disputes? This terrifying final trap was the ultimate weaponization of philanthropic estate planning, designed entirely to execute a posthumous campaign of financial starvation. On December 12, 1872, Edwin Forrest suffered a massive fatal stroke in his Philadelphia mansion, completely alone and consumed by decades of unchecked bitterness. When his highly anticipated last will and testament was officially unsealed and read into the public record, the sheer scale of his enduring hatred for Catherine became immediately, horrifyingly apparent. Edwin possessed an estate valued at well over $1 million, an astronomical, almost incomprehensible sum for an actor in the 19th century. However, instead of allocating a single cent to finally satisfy the massive mountain of court-ordered alimony arrears he owed his legally vindicated ex-wife, Edwin legally transferred nearly his entire fortune into a highly complex, ironclad charitable trust. He explicitly mandated the creation of the Edwin Forrest Home for Retired Actors, a sprawling, heavily funded philanthropic institution designed to house impoverished theatrical performers. On the surface, this appeared to the general public as a profoundly noble, deeply charitable final act from a beloved American icon. But Charles O'Connor and Catherine Forrest instantly recognized the dark, underlying legal architecture of the document. Edwin was intentionally executing a strategy of posthumous asset laundering. He knew that the optics of a wealthy ex-wife actively suing a charitable home for destitute, dying actors would be an absolute public relations nightmare. He was deliberately using the shield of high society philanthropy to permanently lock his wealth entirely out of Catherine's reach. Historical trends in 19th century probate law heavily favored the concept of absolute testamentary freedom, meaning a deceased individual possessed incredibly broad authority to distribute their assets to whichever charities or individuals they desired, frequently leaving surviving estranged spouses completely destitute with zero legal recourse. Edwin was gambling his entire legacy on the assumption that the Pennsylvania probate courts would absolutely refuse to dismantle a massive, highly publicized charitable foundation simply to pay a decade-old out-of-state divorce judgment. Let us fully contextualize the sheer malice of this legal maneuver by projecting it directly into a modern scenario in the current year 2026. Imagine a vastly powerful, incredibly vindictive American industrialist, let us call him Alexander Sterling. Sterling violently loses a heavily publicized, highly acrimonious divorce trial, and is ordered to pay his ex-wife a staggering $50 million settlement due to his proven financial fraud during the marriage. Completely refusing to pay, Sterling spends the next 10 years aggressively dodging enforcement until he suddenly passes away. His will reveals that he has transferred his entire multi-billion-dollar estate into the Sterling Global Climate Initiative, a massive, highly respected nonprofit foundation. He leaves his ex-wife absolutely nothing. The potential outcomes of this 2026 scenario represent a brutal collision of legal jurisdictions. Sterling's ex-wife must now hire an army of elite probate litigators to actively sue a beloved climate charity in federal court, attempting to forcefully liquidate their assets to satisfy her family court judgment. The charity's defense team would aggressively argue that seizing their funds would directly harm their noble mission, weaponizing public sentiment against the ex-wife. This horrifying dynamic, where a legitimate legal debt is completely obstructed by weaponized philanthropy, is precisely the nightmare Edwin Forrest engineered from beyond the grave. Catherine Forrest, now an older woman who had spent the prime years of her life and the entirety of her acting fortune fighting this relentless man, refused to surrender to a ghost. She mobilized her legal team to launch one final, massive assault directly against the executors of the Edwin Forrest estate. This initiated a grueling, deeply unpopular legal war that dragged on for several more years through the labyrinthine Pennsylvania probate courts. Catherine's attorneys constructed a masterful, heavily researched legal argument based on the absolute hierarchy of judicial debt. They aggressively argued that before a deceased individual can give away a single dollar to charity, to family, or to any philanthropic trust, their estate must absolutely satisfy all legally binding court-ordered debts first. They systematically presented the original New York Supreme Court verdict, the subsequent appellate confirmations, and the massive, painstakingly calculated ledger of over 12 years of completely unpaid alimony plus compounding interest. The executors of the Forrest estate fought back with astonishing ferocity, utilizing the exact same delay tactics Edwin had perfected in life. They attempted to claim the New York judgment held no jurisdictional weight in a Pennsylvania probate court, heavily relying on the intense local bias that still revered Edwin Forrest as a working-class hero. They intentionally leaked sensationalized stories to the daily newspapers, portraying Catherine as a greedy, vindictive ghoul actively trying to steal the very beds out from under poor, sick, retired American actors. But the foundational architecture of the United States legal system, specifically the constitutional requirement for states to honor the valid judicial rulings of their neighbors, ultimately proved stronger than Edwin's weaponized charity. In a landmark precedent-setting ruling that fundamentally altered the trajectory of American family and estate law, the courts definitively ruled in favor of Catherine Forrest. The presiding judges declared with absolute finality that a court-ordered alimony judgment constitutes a senior, inescapable legal lien against an estate that completely supersedes any and all testamentary gifts, regardless of how noble or philanthropic those gifts might appear. The court legally forced the executors of the Edwin Forrest estate to systematically liquidate massive portions of his portfolio, selling off real estate, theatrical copyrights, and personal assets. They were compelled by the full authority of the law to hand Catherine Forrest a staggering sum of over $100,000, an amount equivalent to millions in modern currency, representing every single penny of arrears, legal fees, and compounded interest she was owed from the original 1852 verdict. Catherine Forrest had achieved the impossible. She had survived a perfectly engineered public destruction, outmaneuvered the wealthiest and most violent celebrity in America, financed her own defense through sheer entrepreneurial brilliance, and completely shattered a posthumous legal trap designed to starve her. She retired comfortably, living out the remainder of her days in absolute financial security and total vindication, having single-handedly established the foundational modern precedents that currently protect spouses from malicious financial lawfare and fraudulent estate planning. The Edwin Forrest Home for Retired Actors was eventually built using the remaining, significantly diminished funds, standing today as an ironic monument to a man whose greatest enduring legacy was actually the legal empowerment of the woman he spent his entire life trying to destroy. But while Catherine walked away completely victorious, her highly publicized success inadvertently caught the attention of a deeply corrupt faction of New York attorneys. Realizing the massive fortunes that could now be extracted through aggressive divorce litigation, these shadow brokers quietly established an entirely new, highly illegal underground industry designed to manufacture fake evidence for wealthy clients seeking guaranteed separations. What exactly was the structure of this terrifying new blackmail syndicate, and how did they completely paralyze the elite families of the Gilded Age?